Okay, so let's get started here. I just want to make sure that everyone's aware that we are going to be recording this panel, and then we're going to be sharing it after the event for those that may have missed out on it. So my name is Michelle. I'm going to be moderating this alumni panel titled The Future of the Field. This is, I think, the first event as a part of the University of Toronto Engineering Research what's that last word? Conference. I just want to start off with a brief land acknowledgement. So as I'm currently living in Toronto, I wanted to start the session with a land acknowledgement that's specific to the city of Toronto. I acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And Toronto is still home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Port Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. If you're listening from another part of the world, I encourage you to learn about the First Peoples who live where you currently are. At this time, I'd also want to acknowledge what's happening in the world right now as a whole with respect to anti-Black racism movement. And I just wanted to repeat the sentiment that was shared by the UofT president, Merritt Gertler, last week, that the University of Toronto shares the profound concerns that have arisen in response to recent events in the United States and here in Toronto. We acknowledge that these events are unfolding in a context in which Black people in Canada and around the world continue to be subjected to systemic injustices. We join in demanding justice and working towards lasting change in our society. So with that, I'll begin by introducing our 5 panelists today. Joining us, we have John MacDonell, a geological engineering and mineral processing graduate from 17 John is the principal of MacDonell Ventures, has over 40 years experience in delivering mining and mineral capital projects, including business development, project and study management, mineral process design, construction completion, pre-operational testing, and startup for projects globally. We have Michael Zahra, an electrical engineering 8T8, who is the president and CEO of Drone Delivery Canada. Michael holds BASc and MBA at PLOG and has traveled to 57 countries. He is also an author and an active corporate and charity board director. We have Paul Cadario, who I'll refer to as Paul C for this panel, since we have 2 Pauls, who is a civil graduate, 7T3, a distinguished fellow in global innovation at the FASE Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy since 2012. After a 37-year career at the World Bank, and Paul is currently living in Washington, D.C. We have Paul Jansen, or Paul J, who is in mechanical engineering, 7T8, semi-retired and consultant after over 30 years experience in Big Pharma, Sanofi and Eli Lilly, and a multiple patent holder. And finally, we have Utako Tenebe, a CivMin graduate, OT6, a senior associate architect at DLR Group, who was the project architect for the Sampson Pavilion, Cleveland's new health education campus for the Cleveland Clinic and Case Western Reserve University, seeing the project through from design to construction, including 2 years on site. And she recently helped convert the building into a COVID-19 facility less than a year after its original opening in April of 2019. So welcome panelists. Thank you for joining us today. And I will stop sharing my screen so that we can get a look at everyone. All right, so we're going to start out with a few questions, and if you have any questions of your own, please feel free to either add them in the chat or to raise your hand, and I'll call on you when we get to that time. So the first question I have here is just to give a little bit of context to everybody. First, so how has your sector changed since you joined it, and where do you expect it to be 10 to 15 years from now? And I guess we'll start with Paul C, since you're the first one on my screen.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and greetings to everyone who's participating in this event today. I had a rather unusual career in that after I studied civil engineering, specializing in transport, urban, and environment, I went off to Oxford and studied economics and political science. Now, of course, in the 70s, if you studied transport, urban, and environment, that was about as close as you could get to being a social scientist without being a social scientist. So when I graduated from Oxford, I went to the World Bank and spent a very long and interesting career in development. Looking at what's happening in the world today, and I've been retired and then hanging out at the Center for Global Engineering and the Munk School for Global Affairs and Public Policy at UofT for the last 7.5 years. Looking at what's happening in the world today, I think it's, what's old is new again. All of the things that we learned about, and of course have been researched and quantified, are actually having to be renewed and looked at again. Whether it's the importance of cities in the economy, how cities work, the nature of global supply chains, which is of course an engine is made possible because it's about engineering. Everything from what is produced, how is it assembled, how is it moved around, how is it marketed. It's been a big systems problem. And in a way, you could argue that the doctors and the epidemiologists will guide us through the next few years, but the changes in society and at the city level and in country level and the world will really be up to the innovation and ingenuity of engineers as we all reinvent whatever we've done and how we've done it. As a humble civil, I sort of I remember getting on the 900 bus on the Saturday morning, the first Saturday morning in March, and there's a woman there scrubbing it down. And I had just spent 2 days in Toronto, not shaking hands with anybody. Everybody's saying, "Why aren't you shaking hands?" I said, "Because there's a pandemic coming, so elbow bump." And I think that we're all going to start looking at all the things in our physical environment and making our own judgments about risk. And as far as I'm concerned, that's about time. So thank you.
Thank you. Paul J., how has the sector changed, your sector changed since you've joined it, and where do you expect it to go?
Well, my sector is primarily in healthcare, specifically around the delivery of drugs, whether it be inhalation, implantation, injection. And I think it's changed tremendously when I started, and I reflect on doing my graduate work in biomedical engineering at the university. I mean, I think there were 4 or 5 of us in the class back in the 70s. And we all used to think that everything to do with helping people's health was all about, prosthetics and replacements, real engineering type problems. But I think what's happened over time is that biology has become a much bigger factor. And you see everything from the discovery and development of drugs and then the subsequent delivery through to now, and everyone is hearing about all the new and innovative ways that you can create vaccines. I think that what's changing and what has changed is we've moved from this very classic engineering of these problems to convergence of biology and engineering. And there's all kinds of examples of where people are building engineering solutions using biologics. And that's going to continue. And I think it's going to continue at an ever, rapidly increasing rate. I think the other thing that's changing is, and it builds a little bit on Paul C's comments, I think it's the people are re-evaluating and rethinking how they do things. Everything from what it takes to get a drug approved. Do we really need to do all of those approvals? Can we do it faster? And I don't know whether, for example, we'll be successful in getting a COVID-19 vaccine in less than a year. But I can tell you, having worked for a large vaccine manufacturer, typically it takes years to get one that's safe. And even then, you sometimes don't know. And if you're interested in that history, just look up the dengue fever vaccine that was, tested. And then when it was introduced in the Philippines was a huge failure. So I think that we're just going to see this convergence of biology and engineering, and I think it's going to be really exciting what happens in the future in healthcare.
All right, thanks, Paul. Michael, same question.
Sure. So I guess first of all, thanks for having me. Appreciate the opportunity to participate. It was well organized, Michelle. You're a true engineer, so very good.
Thanks.
So I've worked in a few different sectors. Every time I changed jobs, it's actually been a completely different sector. So that's been rather interesting. I started off my career at Motorola doing software for communication systems, and then I was a hardware design engineer at Alcatel for driverless train systems. Then I worked for Schlumberger, which is a large oil and gas company, and then I ran that for a while. And then I ran Yahoo, which is obviously an internet company, and then ran Staples, which is B2B equipment and office supplies. And then now I'm in the drone business, so completely different sector. So if I talk about the sector I'm in now, it's a very, very new sector, obviously, in a very nascent industry. So we're still defining it. I would say we're probably one of the leaders globally. So we're still building the industry, working through the use cases, the business models, as well as the regulatory environment in Canada and the United States and elsewhere. So the industry is very much evolving. So it's changed a lot since I've joined it in 2018. Where I see it in 10 to 15 years, that's a rather difficult question to ask. I think right now it's a B2B application, despite a lot of the coffee and muffin stuff you see delivered on YouTube and whatever. It will evolve to B2C, but I'm sure in our lifetime, probably within 10 years, you'll see unmanned flying drones. I mean, it's happening. They're piloting it in China right now. They're piloting in Dubai right now. So it's, despite it being a very much nascent industry, it's quickly moving and it's taking shape. And I think you'll look back in a few years and say, why didn't we do this earlier? And you'll see people flying around. It's going to be very, very George Jetson. So looking forward to that. So definitely a changing industry.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Zahra.
Hi. Thank you for letting me join. And I do feel like I'm more junior than everybody else who's had a very established long career. I joined the sector of architecture about 7 years ago because after I graduated from civil engineering in 2006, I went back to school for architecture and graduated 2013. So even though I stayed within the same industry of AE, architecture, engineering, and construction, I switched sides to the design aspect. And the change that I've seen so far, from my perspective, I think sustainable design has changed a lot. Earlier on when I joined, there's a big push for certification of sustainable design. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with LEED, leadership in environmental, energy and environmental design. But now people are more interested, clients and designers are more interested in meeting the performance of sustainable design, not just checking off criteria, but actually how does the building perform from an energy perspective. And so this has changed the way we design as well from the core side. Another aspect I've seen change is diversity. I think in architecture, there's a strong culture of apprenticeship, one lead designer, often male, and a team that supports it. And I think there's been a shift to more team-based approach and more effort to include diversity and women in leadership and kind of shift the culture of design. So that's what I've seen. And hopefully 10 to 15 years from now, that'll be more natural without the, forceful push of criteria or such.
All right, thank you so much. And John, lastly.
Yeah, my career has been primarily, out of my 40 odd years, most of it has been in the engineering construction business, all in the mining business. And I did spend a couple of years operating a lead zinc mine in the Canadian high Arctic. So, but I got into actually building things, which has been primarily what my career is all about. in the mine, and all in the mining business. I've never done anything outside of the mining business, but I think the big changes that have happened in the mining business is, and it's tied to the availability of technology and communication, is it's much more in the forefront of the public's eye than it's ever been, and it continues to be that way. So that has, of course, driven a increased focus on ESG, or environment, sustainability, and governance, et cetera. So that's been a highlight that's really been noticeable globally with respect to the mining business. But also in that same vein, what's happened with, by its very nature, mining is, you're always working with a depleting asset. You always have to replace it, and because of that, just about everything is located in remote sites. So those two things are really driving what's happening in mining, and it actually drives the challenges we have in the EPCM business with respect to, and we'll talk more about COVID later, of course, but they're all tied pretty closely together. So the big changes have been having to implement a lot more technology in order to reduce the number of people at these sites, in order to increase efficiencies. And also what's happened in the mining business is that it's all tied directly with commodity pricing. And these days, with the rapid changes with respect to financing, availability, et cetera, dealing with the short-term focus of the capital markets is a huge issue. So in the next couple of years, it's going to be technology. It's going to be getting things done as more quickly than it's happened in the past. And it's also going to be more driven on making sure your operating costs are significantly lower than others, because with the quick changes in the commodity pricing, and therefore your revenue, you're going to have to be able to make sure you can weather those cycles, which is getting shorter and higher amplitude. So those are the big things that are coming up.
Okay, thank you. So the next question kind of feeds into that, I think, a little bit. So what are, maybe list one or two of the biggest challenges that you see being faced in your industry or in your organization in the future? And I guess we'll go in reverse order. So right back to you, John. One or two of the biggest challenges.
The biggest challenge I see is, and I'll talk to the EPCM, or the engineering, procurement, construction aspects within mining, is trying to increase construction efficiency and get projects done quicker, while at the same time minimizing the number of people actually present on a job site. So that is going to drive technology and all kinds of different things that we've never had to do before. The mining companies themselves, of course, are getting almost long in the tooth for operating their equipment remotely. We're going to have to be doing more of that construction-wise. You can't have as many people on a job site at the same time. You need to be able to reduce the number of people at these remote sites. So those are the big challenges. Are how do you take something that by its very nature is, adding one piece of material on top of another and automating that in order to be able to react to the needs of the mining customers, but as well as the needs of the communities, et cetera, around you. So that's probably the biggest challenge, is increasing efficiency while reducing the density of people actually handling materials by hand.
All right, thanks. And Utako?
So when I started working in Cleveland, I started working for a smaller legacy firm. It's heavy on design, where we work closely with the clients and spend a lot of time, concept design to schematic design to construction. But I had the unique experience of my firm getting bought by a larger AE firm called DLR Group. So I was had the experience of going from a small firm to a large, firm based on efficiency and productivity. So one of the things through the transition that I saw was actually, like what John just mentioned on technology and the acceleration of productivity and efficiency. And with that, the client expectation of faster production and faster results and kind of instant product production. So as an architect and designer who, to get the best result, we like to spend time and really think through problems and work with the client, I think the instant production and instant gratification posed a challenge on the quality of design when we think of, longer term, larger picture results. So I think that could be a challenge. We want to take advantage of technology, but we also have to be careful not to lose the quality and the value of our work. So I think that's, I guess, kind of opposite of what John said, but understanding the need for efficiency and productivity as a designer, that's our challenge.
All right, thank you. And Michael, same question.
Sure. So when our industry started, and it's still somewhat starting, really this didn't exist before. So it was a crazy idea when we started this 5-6 years ago. So the challenges we faced obviously were developing the technology because it was all brand new and there wasn't really anywhere you could copy from or get ideas from. And then the regulatory environment. So we're highly regulated in the airspace in Canada with Transport Canada and elsewhere around the world. Each country has its own regulator. So really working through the technology, proving the concept, getting regulatory approval, and then really determining what the business model was a challenge, and then what the use cases were going to be. So we're pretty well through that, and we're fully commercialized and operational, and there are others in the industry. So the industry has taken off, pun intended. But it was definitely challenging in the beginning because it didn't exist, and it's rare in your career that you get to build an industry from scratch. So that's very exciting, but it comes with its gray hair and those sort of things with it, just figuring it all out. So definitely that was the heavy lifting, but there's still more things to figure out in terms of how the regulatory environment is evolving still, and the technology is evolving. And as I said earlier, we'll get to moving people in 5 or 10 years. So heavy lifting's done for the most part, but it was rather challenging just building it literally from scratch. So that's a very unique perspective in that regard.
All right, thank you. Paul J.
Well, I think I thought about this question, and I think there's really two key challenges that the healthcare industry needs to deal with. First of all, it's gaining credibility, and that's probably more focused on the pharmaceutical manufacturing side of the house. But there's surveys that have been conducted around the world that show that the tobacco manufacturers are more respected by the public than the pharmaceutical manufacturers, which is sometimes hard to believe. But there's this impression that the pharmaceutical industry has these absurdly high margins, which they do, and that some countries are paying too much for medicine and all those other challenges that come with that. And I think they're actually right now, surprisingly, maybe that's a positive outcome for the industry from the COVID situation. There's a bit of a tipping point here because they have an opportunity to show what they can do. So I think that one of the big challenges is building back some credibility and getting people to understand what's really involved and why some of these things cost so expensive. And at the same time, I think that part of that credibility comes, and it ties into the other challenge. We have to provide affordable health care to everyone around the world. And right now, the affordability is just not there. And it's not that it's just not available in the developing countries. It's equally not available to those of us that live in the United States. I mean, it's just criminal when you think about the number of people who won't get treatment because they don't have insurance, and even when they have insurance, their co-pays are so high they can't afford it. So we have to deal with that issue, and there has to be some kind of a balance, because you then have a drug company that comes along with a gene therapy, which works wonderful, but they charge $2 million for it. I mean, those two are incompatible. So we're going to have to find a system for healthcare that just makes it more affordable, and that is a real big challenge moving forward.
More on a societal challenge rather than a technical challenge that's faced by the industry itself,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
All right. Finally, Paul C.
Thank you. I'm going to build on what Paul Jansen just said. I think that, what is it now, 11, 12 weeks of working from home and wearing masks and watching too much news and dealing with what we deal with virtually, I think it's made me look at, well, what do I really value? And I'd like to think that we're all looking at that. The healthcare issues in the United States are particularly troubling, in the sense, just for one stylized fact, 160 million Americans and their families rely on their employers for healthcare. And I think last time I checked, it was 40 million people are unemployed. Now, a lot of those people would not have had healthcare at work. But at the same time, a rich advanced society like the United States is supposed to be an example, and really has come up short just on that one issue of healthcare, the question of equity. We look globally, and the question of, well, can everybody afford a mask? And what is the, how does the vaccine get delivered and paid for? Fortunately, aside from the United States, there seems to be agreement that the advanced countries, the developers, and the WHO should take charge of that, and that billions of dollars have been raised for vaccine efficiency. But that's for COVID-19. So what happens when the next one comes along? So that the issues that that we all value about domestic prosperity and tranquility and domestic decision making, actually at a global level, are even more complicated. So in the world that I live in, which is sort of the intersection of technology, public policy, and global affairs, there are enormous numbers of problems to look at, none of which have a unique solution. And the question, I think, in my mind, is of the solutions that are going to be grasped initially because of urgency, and ultimately because they are sustainable. Are we going to make the right choices? And do we trust our governments enough to make the right choices? Canada has long trusted its government. I think France is the same, the Germans. But the United States is, as Pierre Trudeau said, the elephant is a fine neighbor, but when you're the mouse, the elephant sleeps badly, then you notice. So, or something like that. So I think those questions of what do we value in terms of safety, risk, health, prosperity are something we should all be asking ourselves about, even before the issue of discrimination in the United States, which is systemic and historical, came and upended all this, either as the underlying problem and something that needs to be redressed just to get with the pandemic, or whether it is something that, if the United States continues to put it off after more than 400 years, what is the role of the United States in the world, irrespective of whether China or the Americans invent the vaccine and distribute it first? So a lot of the things that we've taken for granted that we were already talking about, I think, are being upended. And we're going to have to hope that the generation of graduate students who are going to go on and do great things, innovate, teach, etc., are going to figure out a way to do that in a way, in a new normal that the rest of us will have to, shall we say, I'm going to say embrace, because I don't think any of us, particularly Michelle and Utako, are old enough we can't learn new tricks. But at the same time, I think it's up to a lot of us who have a traditional way of doing things to say, well, that's gotten us where we are, and is this the way we want our children and grandchildren to live? And we need to cope with that.
All right, thanks, Paul. And that's actually, again, so changing the way we work, another good segue into, I'll make this my last question before I go to the open questions of how has COVID-19 impacted the focus and direction of your industry? So compared to the direction it was headed before this all happened, where has it gone now, if it's changed at all? And I'll go back to John for this one.
Oh, you caught me unawares there with the mute on. Yeah, I think with the both the mining business and the engineering construction business, what COVID has done is actually caused the businesses now to focus, to bring even a higher focus in areas they had already been heading towards because of the reasons I gave earlier. But it makes it even more critical now when you take a look at what's happening with COVID, to reduce the number of people on job sites. And as I said, in the mining business, both in operations and in building projects, these mines, these locations are not close to infrastructure. They're out in the middle of nowhere for the most part. The easy ones have been found and built and developed. The projects now are very isolated. And when you look at a very large mining project, even currently like down in Chile at the moment, you can have 10, 12, 14,000 people in a camp, several hundred kilometers and several thousand meters in the air away from infrastructure. And how do you work with, how do you improve the efficiency of the construction, but also reduce the number of people and deal with the implications of that? And that's both, as I said, from the construction side, but all the operation side. They may not have 14,000 people running the plant, but they'll have 3,000, 4,000. And so that's really what's driving what we see from COVID. It's basically opened the eyes and increased the speed with which we need to find a way to do more with fewer people and increase the efficiency in order to be able to protect people.
Okay, Yutako?
I think there are many directions. First, I think the obvious economic downturn with the construction projects, the clients are going to be less enthusiastic about starting new projects. So it's going to be higher competition bids, and it's going to be harder to get contracts for architects to get projects. And with that, it already seems like retail and commercial sectors are becoming less active, and schools and healthcare, they're becoming the more focused, prominent projects right now. I think the industry is also worried about loss of generation of students coming into the sector of architecture and design, especially those with design thinking. That I think the same thing happened in 2008 when a lot of people ended up doing something else after graduating instead of coming into the workforce, something more creative, because the jobs are so hard to get in the industry. And then also with the work at home model, now that we're adapting to it, I think architects and designers are going to be more task oriented, because that's just going to be the nature of work at home, instead of the larger collaborative, large full project approach to design. So it might change the role of designers. We might have to be more specific or specialist in the work that we do, rather than the holistic approach.
All right, thanks. And I'm just keeping an eye on the time. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'll briefly cover the two questions here that are in the chat, and then maybe if we have time, we'll come back to that COVID-19 related question. I'll direct this question at Paul J first, and if anybody else has any input, feel free to jump in. But do you have any general thoughts on technological development versus precautionary principle? So technology has changed our discovery pace, but is it safe from an environmental and a health perspective?
Sorry, just hit unmute. I think that the healthcare industry is always cognizant of the fact that whatever treatment you provide someone with, there's risks associated with it. And that's something that we just have to accept. The question, I think, is what is an acceptable level of risk? And can we find ways in which the patients, the healthcare providers, can have all the information and make informed decisions? And there's all kinds of examples of where I think that people have not been forthcoming. They've not been totally transparent. And as a result of that, there's been a negative impact as a result of the technology that has been utilized. I think that, you know, the industry is recognizing that, and I think that they are becoming increasingly aware that they have to change and be completely above board and transparent. It's not perfect. There's always some people who aren't there. With respect specifically to the environmental aspect, that's an interesting one because you see a trade-off between some environmental aspects and the safety aspect. So for example, if you're a diabetic and you use a pen injector system, 95% of the world's population uses a disposable pen, a one-time disposable pen. And many people say, why don't you make that reusable? But the challenge is that if you make it reusable, people put the wrong insulin in it, they misuse it, and then you have a safety issue. So there's this continual balance between how do we know what is, do we want to put the safety first or do we want to put the environment first? And I think we've probably got a little bit of an opportunity to do a better balancing act, but that's my general thoughts on how and what's happening in those two areas.
All right. Did anyone else have any thoughts from their perspective? Maybe Paul.
Well, I'll just raise, like I have a whole lot of thoughts on this, but I'm just going to raise two. The first one is that this will end. And we need to be careful that we don't sort of look at what we need to do for the next year or two or three as what we need to do forever. That people will eventually go back to work in those towers on Bay Street, and people will eventually go back to taking the subway. There's probably been a huge move in the mining sector to automate and to have fewer people in remote areas because it's really expensive to produce minerals and extractives in remote areas and to get them out to where they need to be used. And it's, you know, are we looking in fact at the future of work is just going to arrive a little sooner than we thought? And maybe we should be thinking about the future of work and the future of cities without worrying about what time we need to go to the supermarket, as I did this morning. It'll be really nice to be able to go to the supermarket whenever I want. And so that's, I think, the first point I would make. The second one is there's an issue about trust and whether it has to do with regulation and medicines. You know, that Donald Trump may rush out the vaccine because he hopes that'll get him reelected. Well, I don't think that's a great idea. And as my doctor said about Shingrix, which the younger people wouldn't know, it's new, it's here. I'm waiting 6 months. I'll let you know when I've had it. Okay, you'll call me. He says, yeah. And I think that we're going to have to look at what do we trust, which gets back to what do we value. And the future of work is going to be different, particularly for, you know, scholars in who propose to go into academia. I don't think lecturers are going to die. They may not be next year and the year after, but universities will get back to being universities.
Okay, thanks, Paul. This next question I'm going to direct to Michael because I think it's very fitting for this. So, for those who have changed their career path, how did you come to this decision, and how difficult was it to make that change?
Sure. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, every time I changed jobs, changed careers, it was a completely different industry. So I'm not sure that I consciously decided to do that, or the opportunities that I was pursuing happened to be in different industries. But I think you get to a point in a leadership position where the industry itself is obviously it's important, but it's less important, and you get down to managing people, managing process, and all the traditional aspects of management and leadership. So at a certain point, changing industries, I think becomes a little easier because the skills that you're bringing are more transportable than if you were working as an engineer, in a lab or very specific on a kind of project or industry. So I found it a little easier in that regard. But nevertheless, it's something that I didn't consciously decide to do, but it ends up that my career has just been that way, that every time I change jobs, it's been a completely different industry. But again, I think people underestimate the transportable skills that you have, especially engineers, problem solving and all sort of good things, that you can really move around maybe more than you think you can.
Okay, thanks. Has anyone else any thoughts on changing careers?
Well, I was going to jump in. It's Paul Jansen here. Just quickly to say, I think there's kind of two types of processes that I've experienced. Mine is more like Michael's. It's what I call the opportunistic approach. I have a high level of curiosity, and I'm willing to try different things. And I'm a firm believer that when one door closes, the other one opens. And once you've made the decision, go forward. And that's my personality. I think there's another sector of people who are much more comfortable with a very planned out, almost like a project plan of how they want their career to develop. I'm going to do this for 4 years, and then I want to do this, and then I want to do that. And for them, that's probably the best way to progress. And my guess is that they will have a well-developed plan. Whereas I think people like Michael and I, if an opportunity presented itself, I would have never imagined that I'd spend time moving from Canada to the United States, to Germany, back to Boston. But those are just the things the way they happen. So I think those are the two ways in which it can happen.
John, did you have something to add in there?
Yeah, well, I've always been attached to the mining business, but I've worked in business development, I've worked in construction, I've worked in process design, I've worked in all different aspects. So in a way, those were changes in career. And I think based upon, what Michael said is that these things happen as a natural progression as you're working through a career, and opportunities present themselves. They can present themselves because it's a natural next step. They can also present themselves, as I've seen, in the cyclical nature of when my boss came up to me once when I was working as a design engineer. He said, "We really like having you here, but we're running out of work. So if you want to continue to work here, put your BD hat on, go out there and get work." And that's really how I got into business development. And then so I turned myself into a seller doer, as we call it. As I worked off one job, I went out and did some business development, got another project. And then I worked that into, probably my last 10 years has been full-time business development globally for a couple of mining companies. So it's got a lot to do with somewhat of a natural progression in a way, and taking advantage of opportunities when they present themselves. I never could have written a plan 40 years ago as to where I was going with any chance of it actually working out that way. Things just happen.
Thank you for that. We're at 11:44 right now. I wonder if anyone has a quick comment on this last question here. Do you recommend us to study PhD or to find a job during this COVID time? And I'm not aware that any of you actually have a PhD, but maybe just from a business perspective, if you can provide some insight.
Well, I hang out at UofT in several faculties. And my view is that if you have a supervisor who has a great topic that you're really excited about, why would you go in the job market just now? The PhD is something where you get the depth and the breadth of the field. And as long as you don't go into something that is too narrowly academic, I would have thought the PhD is, from a personal and professional point of view, the way to spend the next few years, rather than get a job that you might regret forever that you didn't pursue that idea. So if you got an idea, go for it.
All right, and I'll finish off with Utako. As someone who went back and got a second degree, do you have any thoughts about maybe not just PhD, but going off and doing something else as well?
Yes, because I did the architecture program, which is 3.5 years. And my husband is also in academia in biology, so he has a PhD. And I think doing a PhD to buy time, if you're not interested in the topic, it could be dreadful. So I think similar to what Paul said, if there's an idea or research you'd like to spend time on honing and developing, I think I'd say go for it. Great timing. But otherwise, spending 3, 4, 5 years on a topic without a direction could be really hard to motivate. So I'm sure, Michelle, you would know too, but I would say yes, if you have a topic that you're passionate about, but not just to buy time.
Okay, thank you. And so with that, we're at about 11:45. We will break off into the